My colleague Mark Keeley, who is the head of our secretariat on the building review panel, is going to drive the slides for me. So that'll enable me to concentrate on what I'm talking about and not have to worry about doing that. Thank you so much for inviting me to give you an update on the Victorian Building System Review. I heard the Minister's comments earlier where he describes it, as he always does, as the most comprehensive review of the building system in Victoria's history. And it certainly is from our point of view. And I'm looking forward to telling you about where we've got to, giving you an update on that, and foreshadowing the release very shortly of our discussion paper that we're going to put out for your feedback and your input and your comment. I'd also like to congratulate the VBA and you, Bronwyn, for what looks like it's going to be yet another successful and useful Surveyors Conference. So well done. I want to start with a quick recap of how this building review came about. Just before we forget, you know, there's so many reviews and there's so much activity going on. Why did the government commission the expert panel to lead this review? It's one of the key recommendations of the Cladding Task Force, which found that systemic review is required so that the building system proactively responds to risk to deliver a quality and safer built environment for Victorians in an efficient and effective way. And so there are two reports that really drive the work that we're doing with the panel. One is the Cladding Task Force report, and one, of course, is the Building Confidence report. So you'll hear me refer to both of those through my presentation. In response to that recommendation, the government, through Minister Wynne, established the expert panel. You have just heard from Dame Judith, and I'm sure you will agree that we are very fortunate to have her on the panel. As you can hear from her presentation, the UK is going on a similar journey in terms of building regulatory reform, and we've learned an awful lot from her about the importance of industry and practitioner improvements, and obviously consumer improvements as well. We have other panel members who also bring great expertise and knowledge. Dr. Jerry Ayres, who leads the occupational health policy work at the CFMEU, Professor Ian Bailey, a professorial fellow at Melbourne Law School who specialises in construction law, Lauren Solomon, who heads up the Consumer Policy Research Centre based here in Victoria, and Melanie Fasham, who represents the building industry and is also here today. And I want to welcome Melanie specifically. So each panel member contributes to our work on the basis of their skills and practical experience, and I'd like to thank them all for their commitment to delivering a stronger building system for Victorians. So far, since we first met last February, we've held 6 formal meetings and participated in another 5 intensive workshops as part of our work over the last year. We've also benefited from a significant number of meetings with relevant stakeholders, including many of you who are participating today. As I mentioned, we'll be shortly releasing our first discussion paper called Framework for Reform in March, and I'll outline some of the relevant parts of that to you shortly. Okay. I don't need to tell this audience that concurrent with the review that the expert panel is leading, a huge amount of reform is underway in Victoria, and this is impacting on industry, practitioners and the broader community. Many of the reforms listed on this slide address the recommendations made by the Building Confidence Report and the Cladding Task Force, and we heard from Sue Eddy earlier about many of these and more that the VBA is rolling out, and also the government is rolling out. So it's really important to recognise that the panel's review is not happening in isolation from any of these other activities. In fact, we're working very closely with the department, with the VBA, with Cladding Safety Victoria, and with other industry and professional associations to ensure that there is a coherent journey to overall reform. And while the panel has clear priorities and emphases of its own, we are also keen to ensure that our work complements and builds on the recommendations of the Building Confidence Report and the Cladding Task Force. Okay. It is fair to say that the panel has focused a lot in our discussions so far on the significant changes which have impacted building surveyors as a profession over the last 30 years. The role of private building surveyors and their regulatory oversight have been the subject of considerable debate amongst the panel, in industry, in the broader community, in the media. Not just here in Victoria, but in other jurisdictions in Australia and around the world. There are two conclusions in particular, which in my view warrant attention. First, that the regulatory system has not kept up with the massive changes which have been seen in construction, in its practices, its technologies, and its materials, and the impact of these changes on the role and expectations of building surveyors. And secondly, that accountabilities of building industry participants across the whole construction process, from design to build to maintenance, have not been clearly defined or appropriately allocated as these changing patterns and practices in construction have taken place. And so what has this led to? This has resulted in a disproportionate burden falling on the building practitioners with statutory responsibilities, and that means the relevant building surveyor. I've highlighted two statements on this slide which resonate. One from the Building Confidence Report about weak regulatory oversight and the importance of that factor in some of the regulatory failure that we've seen over the last few years. And one from a private building surveyor who I met with recently, who I thought articulated the changing and increased expectations of that role really well. But both of these quotes that I've put on those slides emphasise the challenges in reforming this area. So the first thing to explain about the building system review is that the panel has set out a staged approach to reform. Stage one, which will be the main focus of our forthcoming discussion paper that you'll see in the next few weeks, is concerned with four key areas: practitioner registration and regulation, building approval processes, including the role of the building surveyor, regulator roles and responsibilities, and improvements in consumer representation. And I want to make an overriding point that a number of panel members have made as we've looked at the drafting of our discussion paper, which is that all of the changes that the panel is considering in terms of practitioner registration, building approvals, regulator roles and responsibilities, and the things that we've seen that have already been rolled out, they will all improve the consumer experience, every single one of them, because they mean fewer defects, they mean fewer disputes. So if we get this right and we continue this reform journey well, we are looking at a significant improvement in consumer experience. The last item on that column on the left about improving consumer representation is about how the consumer is best represented within the government system. Although the areas in stage one are the main focus of the discussion paper, the paper will also set out the three key steps that the three key stages that you can see on that slide and how they will work. In the time I have left, I will focus on the panel's approach to the issues highlighted in red on that slide. First, practitioner registration and regulation. This area has been a major focus of reforms to date, as we heard from Matt under the auspices of the ABCB, and we heard from Sue and others about the VBA and the changes that the VBA is making to practitioner registration and regulation. There's a lot of work already happening in this area, but it's a continuing stream of reform work, and the issues go to the need for improved accountability across the construction processes and better standards across the entire construction process. I've highlighted at the bottom of that slide the panel's approach to considering further options to improve practitioner registration. They include looking at better alignment of practitioner classes to modern construction practices, for example. In terms of the role of building surveyors and the different types of surveyors, this is the other aspect I wanted to mention today. The panel has received detailed and thoughtful proposals from ABES, the VMBSG and the Municipal Association of Victoria about ways in which building surveyors can be regulated to improve industry performance. In our discussion paper, we have set out each of these proposals and we've set out our own assessment of what we think the pros and cons of each of those are, and we're asking for feedback about whether we've got that right or not. This part of the framework for reform will be of particular interest to all of you, and we look forward to lots of conversations and discussions with you to get your detailed feedback. Some of the key elements of the different models that are being proposed are summarised at the bottom of the slide, and they include strengthening oversight for PBSs, as was recommended in the BCR and cladding task force, embedding risk-based approaches to building approvals overall, a greater role for the state building surveyor, MBSs and peer reviews, and independent reviews of design documentation. So, to sum up, the Framework for Reform discussion paper will be released for consultation in coming weeks. We are working with all key stakeholders, including the VBA, VMBSG, ABES, the MAV, industry and unions, to ensure that there are ample opportunities for consultation. We'll be using the Engage Victoria platform, which we found very useful in a review that we did on planning a couple of years ago. It's important to the panel to make sure that our final recommendations to the Minister are fully informed, soundly based, practical, emphasise transparency, and that they're effective in delivering improvements to the building system in the interests of consumers, the construction industry, the practitioners and the community. And we look forward to your feedback when the paper is released in March. Thank you.